This was between my third and fourth year in college, and in the summer, for half of the summer. And I got the family canoe, which was a two-person canoe, and put my pack at one end and got in the canoe, and there was an old man who, he must have asked me where I was going, and it was a windy day, and he said, something like, you'll never get there, because one person in a two-person canoe is difficult to manage. And as you can see from the fact that I'm a continuation of that person's existence, I did get there, but it was through riding the waves in the middle of the wave. And I knew I had to get around I had to get around that bend and then go a bit after that. And after that bend in the lake. And had a good time there. There's no, I don't know how I got water. Don't even remember now. No electricity. It's pretty much, I refer to it as a cliff. There's a rapid rise, steep rise behind the cabin. And I learned to climb it in time. I didn't want to climb it at first. And eventually I would climb it and then walk the distance to town, which I think was 5 miles. But maybe old age exaggerates it, but I think it was 5 miles. And stay overnight in town. Walk back. And then at some point I canoed to the other end of the lake. Having learned how to manage the two-person canoe, and stayed overnight in the hotel. One time I went out a little distance in the canoe and was sunbathing, so to speak, in the canoe, and there's a fly came up on my forehead or somewhere, and I shooed it away, and also shooed away my glasses. And was smart enough not to dive in to retrieve my glasses. So then, semi-blind, after probably a few days, canoed into town. And I was sufficiently from the initial canoe, or maybe I had canoed in between time, canoed back into town, and in that state of not being able to see too well. Somehow I ended up at a woman's house and asked if she had any old glasses. and she had a pair of old frames. I didn't have much money, as you can see, and took a bus into Montreal, and I don't know. I can't imagine. I went to an optometrist. Maybe I probably had to go to an optometrist because I had to get new lenses. I used to do sky meditation when I would hike up to the top of the hill. It was flat up there, top of the cliff. It's not a cliff. Can't call it the rapid rise. And lie on the ground. There was a field up there. Anyway, so it's really nice to see the lake. It looks very placid today.
Yeah, that's a photo from like a month ago or something like that.
Oh, it's a photo.
A virtual background.
Wow, that's quite a photo. What's the name of the lake?
Massawippi.
Wow, I never knew it at the time. Wow, I used to stare out at the other side. At that point, I used to wish that there were no lights at night on the other side. But that's sort of stupid, I have to say. But not that I disown the person who wished that there were no lights. I'm the kind of person who creates continuity with myself back to my crib. Many people disown their former self. I see a strong continuity. And sometimes disown, what do I want to say? Disown some of the difficulties of the differences. One of my colleagues at the University of Virginia, who subsequently became the chair, said, one's PhD thesis, something like, a child's exercise. Well, that was meditation on emptiness, was my PhD thesis. I did do some revisions afterwards, but I didn't disown it the way he disowned his PhD thesis. A child's exercise. Harumph. This first paragraph, which begins to make this very point. So we're switching from one Mongolian to another Mongolian, from Dendalharamba to Ngag-wang-pal-dan. And Ngag-wang-pal-dan switches to use the word person because he wants to make room to hold that these are two realizations. And at the very end of this chapter, I had to revise the point, my own point, that what Dendal Laramba is saying is that he's making the point that there's a single realization. So I had to drop. Jeffrey Hopkins today has to drop the earlier Jeffrey Hopkins point, harumph, that what Dendal Laramba is saying is that this is a single realization. So I'm going to have to go through the whole chapter, everything I've said about Dendal Laramba in this whole chapter. That he's not saying it's a single realization, but it's two realizations, the one deepening the other realization. So I previously jumped to the wrong conclusion. So I was saying two different things within my remarks in the same chapter. Because here I'm saying that Dendal Laramba and Ngag-wang-pal-dan are getting around having to say that it's a single realization, a single consciousness that realizes two things, two points. And Ngag-wang-pal-dan gets around it by saying person. And last time, as I was preparing for our meeting, something flashed to mind, a metaphor. I don't know if metaphor, simile, flashed to mind. And how relevant it is, I'll leave it for you to decide. It was of somebody, a smart person playing, I don't know if smart person playing ping pong. And you're learning from how another good ping pong player returns your response. You know, you turn it over the net and you learn from what I learned from what the other person plays, right? Because the other person's a good player. And I'm learning as I play. I'm learning from two directions. Two things are going on. When the other person makes a good move, a good return, I learn something. And when I make a good return, a good move, I learn something about my own playing. Two things are going on. It's two things of similar type. Whereas reflecting on dependent arising and reflecting on emptiness are very different. Reflecting on emptiness is reflecting on a mere negative. Reflecting on dependent arising is a positive. But you get dependent arising itself, emptiness itself is a dependent arising. Every dependent arising doesn't have to be a positive. But in this case, when we're talking about appearance includes emptiness is also an appearance. But in this case, where we're talking about appearance and emptiness, appearance includes, I'm being very technical now, in the midst of talking roughly. I'm also talking finely, switching from one to the other. Appearance includes Ngag. What's Ngag in English? Affirming negatives and mere negatives. What's Ngag?
Non-affirming negatives.
Non-affirming negatives. Thank you. I've got to that stage in life. Maybe it's because I just woke up from a 15-minute nap. It's dangerous to do, but I had to do it. So, appearance, non-affirming negatives appear. Affirming negatives appear. Positives also appear. But when we talk about appearance and emptiness, I wonder whether we're talking about positives and non-affirming negatives. Well, it's not so technical, in other words. Dependent arising and emptiness. In any case, reflecting on dependent arising, as much as you do that, when you're really good at it, it promotes more understanding of emptiness. And when you're really good at reflecting, understanding emptiness, it promotes more understanding of dependent arising. So if you're going to talk about, if you're going to talk about a combination of these two, since they're two different things, the one way you can unite or speak about a combination of these two, then one way is to use the word person. This is a frequent way of uniting these two, is to talk about the person. Okay. So, that's an intro that Hopkins makes so that one can understand what Ngag-wang-pal-dan is talking about when he quotes Tsongkhapa's three principal aspects of the path, when he uses words like when he responds to, when he tries to figure out what Tsongkhapa is saying without alternation and simultaneously. You see, Tsongkhapa's hit us with a problem that there's no alternation and it is simultaneous. So Ngag-wang-pal-dan's trying to give us a way to understand within the context of it's not just one consciousness, to understand what Tsongkhapa is talking about. So he begins in his commentary by saying, for persons. You see? That's why he uses this tricky word, persons. For persons who have completed analysis of view in this way. And then a few lines down, to that same degree does the force of their awareness conceiving inherent existence diminish. Something goes on within the person, you see. Now, he quotes the stanza, and then after that he says accordingly, and then there's a bullet. For persons who have completed analysis of the view in this way, the way the extreme of existence is avoided through appearance, that means through contemplating emptiness, is that as much as they take to mind the meaning of dependent arising, okay, which is merely posited by name and terminology, to that same degree, as much as they contemplate that. And so the more you contemplate it, and the more you're sunk into it, you see, into that one, somehow within that person, their awareness conceiving inherent existence. Now where is that awareness? He's got to mean that awareness comes up later. When that awareness becomes manifest later, that's how I read it, that diminishes. But that means due to contemplating dependent arising, then somehow within that person, that awareness which isn't manifest at that time, it diminishes. This goes on within the person, even though that awareness isn't manifest. That's how I read it. For such persons, the way the extreme of, that's why he uses the word person. For such persons, that's the second bullet, the way the extreme of non-existence, nihilism, is avoided through emptiness. Now you're contemplating emptiness, and somehow the extreme of falling into nihilism is that as much as they take to mind the emptiness of inherent existence. Now you see, usually the case is the more you take to mind emptiness, right, the more you fall into nihilism. But because you've become so adept at the limitation of what emptiness refutes is just inherent existence and not existence, then as much as you reflect on emptiness, to that same degree does the force of not believing in the cause and effect of karma, and then the flip side of that, and apprehending the cause and effect of karma to be non-existent, diminish. You see, a whole lot goes on within the mind that is not openly doing things, so you see two things are going on at the same time, but one is manifest and the other is going on subliminally, but not manifestly. Wow. So you see, this psychology is not simple-minded, as if only one thing goes on in the mind at a time. A lot of Buddhists get the idea that only one thing, Buddhism is really a very simple-minded psychology. Only one thing can go on at a time. A sutra, Ngag-wang-pal-dan cites a sutra, which he says cites the same thing, says the same thing. Those which are produced from causes and conditions are not produced inherently. And the next line says that. Oh, what do you mean they're not produced? They have no inherent nature of production. So Buddha himself specified what kind of production don't things have no inherent nature of production. This note doesn't tell you where the brackets come from, as I remember. The note doesn't tell you. Or does it?
Yes. It says from 4 intervals.
Oh yeah, the 4 interwoven annotations. Cool. So that's probably from the Sarache scholar. Anyway. Maybe it'll just pop up. Therefore, those which rely, it's only Giant Shiva and the Sarache scholar at that point, as I remember. And it's not Giant Shiva. A person, so therefore, those which rely on cause and conditions are said by the conqueror to be empty. Well, okay, empty of inherent existence. Now, a person who knows the emptiness, of course, of inherent existence is conscientious. Now, what's really important is to know that Hopkins wasn't Hopkins. None of these notes, brackets are from Hopkins. At overcoming the unpeacefulness of afflictive emotions. And my memory is that actually these come from Tsongkhapa's illumination of the thought. At overcoming the unpeacefulness of afflictive emotions. Now the reasons why, okay, no, I don't need to jump. Whoever has generated doubt toward what is not obvious in Buddha's word. There are 3 levels of phenomena. The manifest, the slightly I used to say hidden, the slightly obscure, and the very obscure. What's not obvious here is not the slightly obscure, but the very obscure in Buddha's word. The very obscure will believe that only Buddha is omniscient based on his profound teaching of emptiness. And there's a nice layout in the big book I sent you on absorption in no external world that I lifted part of a long series that relies on Dharmakirti, Tignaga Dharmakirti, that explains that not obvious, which could mean the slightly obscure or the very obscure. And it's very clear that it's referring to Buddha's teaching on the very obscure. In other words, Buddha taught many doctrines about the very obscure, which it's hard to develop faith in. It's what comes to my mind is early on in my relationship with His Holiness, the Dalai Lama asked me, how has it come that you have faith in the Buddha with respect to the very obscure? And I quickly said, because of his teaching of emptiness, which I think I knew at that time about Aryadeva's, these lines from Aryadeva, but my faith did not come from that. It came from Nagarjuna's teaching about emptiness, which comes from the Perfection of Wisdom Sūtras, this unrelenting teaching about emptiness. And Nagarjuna's particular, there's 27 chapters on unrelentingly teaching of many different approaches within every chapter. Many approaches within every chapter on emptiness. That was very, very attractive to me. His Holiness did not say, wow. He just sort of, he didn't. It was like, The problem within the tradition is that if you apply the reason, the scriptural reasonings, it's very difficult to come to this conclusion because you have to read all the scriptures and apply a complex. You have to see that there's no contradiction within his teachings, and the tradition tells you where there are no contradictions, blah, 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 and so forth. And the tradition itself has come to decide that the teaching of a flat earth that there are no contradictions on this topic, and there are a whole lot of problems. And during that time, a little earlier than that, but there was a great uproar when I was getting into Buddhism, early on. The heart, for instance, there was no such thing as heart surgery. You couldn't donate your heart, and somebody else couldn't use your heart. It was proprietary. Only you could use your heart. This was passed down as one of those teachings. There was a Larimba Geshe on the next street in Freewood Acres who thought it was impossible to go to the moon. All sorts of barriers were broken. He said, well, that was just made up by the United States military, the United States government. He used to watch television. He was going blind, and he used to put his head pretty near the television. And he said it was made up. And, things were in uproar. And, there are teachings that, the teachings on ethics were said to be in that category. You'd get confirmation based on the Buddha's teachings on the Four Noble Truths. Or, as Aryadeva put it, on Buddha's teaching of emptiness. His Holiness developed a new view on this. It was really, for us, at that time, a rather dramatic new teaching, that there was a concordance between cause and effect in rough terms between committing murder and having to undergo murder. But that if you committed murder, that in a particular lifetime you would have to undergo this particular kind of murder, that would be very obscure. That would be in the very obscure category. His Holiness worked this out. I don't know this because His Holiness told me. His Holiness announced this in public. And he didn't announce it as a revision. He just taught it. Do you follow me? He didn't teach this as a revision. But for those of us who knew what the general teaching was, that the teachings of ethics were in that category, then when he taught this different teaching, we could recognize that he had shifted the general teachings on ethics into the category of the slightly obscure. And the fine details on ethics he left in the very obscure. And I found that very appealing, because I never, my own instinct on the matter was Buddhist, when I came to Buddhism, was that the teachings on ethics, the general teachings on ethics, were appealing to me, were just plain appealing to me. I didn't require that it came from Daddy Buddha for me to believe in them. Follow me? I don't mean follow me. Do you understand what I'm saying? That the teachings on general ethics, made sense to me. And that what His Holiness was saying, the particular ones would be in a very obscure category. And if you read what I sent in the email, they are more obscure but less profound. Less profound than emptiness. Emptiness is more profound but less obscure. They're in the category of slightly obscure, whereas the fine details on ethics, that by doing a certain ill deed, you're going to suffer murder, you're going to be killed on a certain day at a certain time in a certain place, undergoing a certain type of murder in blah blah lifetime. That's very obscure but less profound than emptiness. That's why you can draw the conclusion based on Buddha's profound teaching of emptiness that only Buddha is omniscient with respect to the very obscure details of ethics and so forth. And even the shape of the universe. And we have to say that the teaching on the shape of the universe, the shape of this planet that we're on as being flat, was given, we have to say, was given to certain people at a certain time based on their perspective. And you could say that in fact the Buddhist scriptures are not uniform with respect to the earth, the globe, or whatever, this thing that we're living on is flat, because in Kala Chakra, he didn't say that. His Holiness didn't say that. But as Alex Burson points out, it's more like donut shape. Yes?
Could you perhaps briefly say something about what makes a topic more or less profound?
More or less profound, I would guess here that since the profundity of emptiness comes because by realizing it, one can remove the obstructions to liberation, and eventually the obstructions to omniscience. Once, and to do the latter, of course, one has to, depending on, well, put it this way, with regard to both of those, one has to accompany them with their respective scope of merit. So, I want to tie this into the title of the essence of all of Buddha's scriptures is emptiness. in Tibetan, Lake Nyingbo. So that's why I sent that quote. I didn't want to just make the declaration that not obvious here means the very, very obscure, not the slightly obscure. After all, emptiness is the slightly obscure, which is in the last line, based on his profound teaching of emptiness. And I wanted you to see, I didn't want to just talk about emptiness being slightly obscure. Now I'm, but what? Very, very what? Fill it in for me, please. Very profound. Yeah, more profound. Oof. Yes. And this way you could turn to that written document and go over it even many times, and then even open up what I sent you earlier, and in that case it's embedded in a different argument. I don't know, it's worthwhile trying to work out the different argument that I lifted it from. Then, so it's one marvelous point of let's put it this way, each of the textbook traditions has marvelous points, and one of the marvelous points of the Jain tradition is that they like having long textbooks. And that doesn't mean that the other major traditions don't have all of this material somewhere, either in their written or oral traditions. They do have it. But for someone like me who's working largely within the written tradition, this isn't Jain Sheba, but it's a couple of Mongolians who are working within that literary tradition. It's nice to have it available. In this case, Ngag-wang-pal-dan was particularly interested also in Benchen Sonam Trakpa, Losaling's tradition. He was interested in both, which even raised the ire of the Jain Sheba tradition. They got fed up with him having his feet or legs. We say in English we usually say feet in both traditions, but he certainly had his whole body in both of those traditions. And somebody like Jangya Roe Dorje had his whole body in the Sarache tradition also, and maybe more of his body in the Sarache tradition, which is very enriching to have your whole body also in another tradition. So now, Ngag-wang-pal-dan whose whole body also was in the Losaling tradition, makes a critical comment against, one can say, critical comment about Jangya, whose whole body also, I think, as I remember, one of his great teachers, as I remember, was a head of Gelugpa Ganden Chiba. So head of Gelugpa, who was from in the Sarache tradition, and he makes the comment critical of Jangya, where Jangya is saying that all saying that he's saying, although nowadays, in this indented quote, it's widely renowned that the extreme of existence is avoided through appearance, and the extreme of non-existence is avoided through emptiness, is not unique, meaning is not unique to the consequent school. He's saying, forget it. It is unique to the consequent school. He's saying, look around and see if the other schools, whatever way you want to do it, go from the top to the bottom. Do the autonomous have this teaching? Does the mind-only school have this teaching? Does the sutra school following reasoning have this teaching? Does the sutra school following scripture have this teaching? Do any of the so-called 18 great exposition schools have this teaching? If you feel they do, find it and bring it to me. That's what he's saying. He's saying it in a roundabout way. Do some research. Find it. Bring it to me. I'd like to see it. He's giving people... you would think that the autonomous should have it. I said, I have this qualm. Won't they have it? I don't know. But if I want to raise my hand, I'll raise my left hand instead of my right hand with my black glove on. That's pretty funny. I mean, it's really nice that so the abbot of Shravasti this issue that I'm trying to dump on her. And it's really, she raised a very nice issue, and that's why I want to dump it on her. Because it really seems she had a good point. I mean, that I'm admitting that I felt she had a good point. This illusion-like realization after meditative equipoise. And then she also raised the issue that I thought was really good. She raised the issue with me, does meditative equipoise have to be direct realization? And down somewhere here in my marvelous chapter, I say I walked into saying that meditative equipoise, realizing emptiness, had to be direct realization. And then I see it. And she raised that question to me, and I said, I don't think it has to be direct. And, that's recorded from me. And then here in print, I say it has to be direct. And I have to eat crow, whatever that means. I guess crow tastes terrible, and you wouldn't want to eat crow if you're a meat eater. So I have to eat my own words. And I deleted the word here, directly realizing. So, because it's either the second or fourth mention Lama, I don't think he's talking about direct realization when we talk about meditative equipoise. So that word direct that comes up down here. And remember, the word inference is used very roughly, because remember that in the consequence school, I'm just priming you for reading for the next time. Inference is used roughly here because remember in the second period of inference, where you're no longer relying on the reason to generate your conceptual realization of emptiness, that's not called inference in the consequence school. It's just called conceptual realization that's no longer dependent on the reason. But if your understanding, your realization of emptiness weakens, then you have to rely on the reasoning, right? You have to refurbish your weakened understanding by reflecting on the reasoning again. So then it would then be, there would be a period of inference, and then after that you'd be relying on the experience, right? And where you're relying on the experience for the continued realization of emptiness, conceptual realization, then that's no longer called inference in the consequence school. So we'll stop there. And see you again.